In the early 2000s, the United States Navy embarked on one of the most ambitious and controversial journeys in its modern history. It was meant to be a revolution, a new class of ships that would completely transform how America projected its naval power around the world. They called it the Littoral Combat Ship, or LCS. The promise was seductive: fast, versatile, and affordable ships capable of operating in the shallow coastal waters where the conflicts of the 21st century would be fought. But what began as a revolutionary vision quickly turned into one of the greatest military acquisition disasters in American history. This is the story of how billions of dollars were spent, how careers were destroyed, and how one of the Navy's most promising projects became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when ambition meets reality. To understand how we got here, we need to go back in time. It was the year 2001. The world had just witnessed the September 11th attacks, and the Pentagon was completely rethinking its military strategy. For decades, the American Navy had been built for a singular purpose: to confront the Soviet Union in massive naval battles on the high seas. Giant aircraft carriers, heavy cruisers, powerful destroyers, all designed to dominate the deep oceans. But now, with the Cold War over and new types of conflict emerging, naval strategists realized something important. Most future threats would not come from enemy fleets in the Pacific or the Atlantic. They would come from coastal waters, from remote ports, from hidden coves where insurgent groups and hostile states operated. They needed something new, something different, something that could enter those shallow, dangerous waters that military analysts called the littoral zone. The vision was clear. Imagine a ship that could do almost anything. One day, it would be a minesweeper, scouring coastal waters for hidden explosives. The next day, it would transform into an anti-submarine platform, chasing silent diesel submarines in shallow seas. The following week, it would be a surface operations platform, engaging fast attack boats and asymmetric threats. All this with the same vessel. The key would be modularity. The ship would have different mission packages that could be switched like apps on a smartphone. Small crews, low costs, incredible speed, and mass production. The Navy talked about building 50, 60, maybe even 75 of these ships. They would be present in coastal areas around the world, providing an American presence at a fraction of the cost of traditional ships. Before we continue this incredible journey, if you're enjoying this content, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know what time you're watching this documentary. Now, let's dive deep into this fascinating story. In 2004, the Navy did something unusual. Instead of choosing a single design, it selected two. Two different consortia would receive contracts to build competing versions of the Littoral Combat Ship. On one side was Lockheed Martin, one of the world's largest defense contractors, proposing a sleek, angular monohull design that looked like it came straight out of a science fiction movie. On the other side was a consortium led by General Dynamics, proposing a radical trimaran design with three hulls that promised unprecedented stability and space. The idea was that competition would keep costs low and innovation high. Both designs would be tested, refined, and eventually the Navy would choose the winner. At least that was the theory. The first signs of trouble appeared quickly. The initial estimated cost for each ship was $220 million, an aggressively low price, especially for such an advanced vessel. Engineers raised concerns. Accountants questioned the numbers. But the political pressure was immense. The Navy needed these ships. Congress wanted results. And the contractors assured everyone they could deliver. The first contracts were signed. Construction began. And then, slowly, methodically, everything began to fall apart. The first problem was fundamental. Nobody really knew how to build these ships. Lockheed Martin was attempting radical innovations in its Freedom-class design. Aluminum instead of steel in many areas to save weight. Complex propulsion systems combining gas turbines and diesel engines. Signature reduction technology that would make the ship harder to detect. All of this sounded impressive in PowerPoint presentations. In reality, it meant that each ship would essentially be a prototype. General Dynamics faced its own challenges with the Independence-class design. Nobody had built a military trimaran of this size before. How would it behave in rough seas? How do you repair an aluminum hull when it cracks in the middle of the ocean? These were questions without clear answers. In 2008, the USS Freedom, the first ship of the Lockheed Martin class, was commissioned. It was a grand ceremony, full of speeches about innovation and American power. But behind the scenes, engineers were already identifying serious problems. Cracks appeared in the hull during testing. The propulsion systems overheated. The software integration that was supposed to make the ship easy to operate was incredibly complex and prone to failure. And then came the first major public revelation. In 2009, during a routine deployment, the Freedom suffered a catastrophic propulsion system failure. Pieces of metal broke off from the turbines, causing massive damage. The ship had to be towed back to port. The Navy tried to downplay the incident, but naval engineers around the world shook their heads. Was this the future of naval operations? The USS Independence, the first trimaran, was commissioned in 2010. It also had its moments of glory, including demonstrations of its impressive speed, capable of exceeding 40 knots, making it one of the fastest military ships ever built. But speed comes at a price. The Independence and its sister ships consumed fuel at an alarming rate at high speeds. More worryingly, the trimaran design created unexpected challenges. Vibration was intense, causing fatigue in the crew and equipment. And the aluminum hull, although lightweight, was surprisingly fragile. In 2012, significant cracks were discovered in the hulls of multiple Independence-class ships. These were not just superficial cracks. They were structural flaws that compromised the ship's integrity. But perhaps nothing symbolizes the failure of the LCS program better than the saga of the mission packages. Remember, this was the central revolutionary idea. Modular ships that could swap capabilities as needed. The Navy invested billions in developing 3 main mission packages: surface operations, anti-submarine operations, and mine countermeasures. Each package would include specialized equipment, drones, sensors, and weapons that could be installed and removed as the mission changed. In theory, a commander could receive a ship configured for mine hunting today, and within 2 weeks have it reconfigured for anti-submarine operations. The flexibility would be unprecedented. The reality was devastatingly different. The mission packages proved extraordinarily problematic. The surface operations package was relatively simple, essentially adding more weapons and radar systems, but it still suffered from limited range and questionable capabilities against modern threats. The anti-submarine package presented serious challenges. The sonar systems were inadequate for detecting silent modern submarines. The lightweight torpedoes they carried were of dubious effectiveness. And the entire system's integration was so complex that it rarely worked as promised. But the real disaster was the mine countermeasures package. The Navy spent over $3 billion developing mine hunting systems for the LCS. This included specialized helicopters, unmanned underwater vehicles, towed sonar systems, and a variety of exotic sensors. The problem was that nothing worked reliably. The underwater drones got lost. The helicopters couldn't operate safely from the small decks of the ships in adverse conditions. The sensors constantly gave false positives. In test after test, the systems consistently failed to detect and neutralize mines. In 2016, a devastating report from the Pentagon's Office of Operational Test and Evaluation concluded that the LCS's mine hunting systems were fundamentally inadequate for real-world operations. And here's a detail that makes it all the more bitter. While the American Navy struggled with its billion-dollar mine hunting system that didn't work, smaller navies around the world were using commercially available drones and sensors to do the same job more effectively and at a fraction of the cost. It was a technological humiliation of epic proportions. But let's talk about money, because the numbers are absolutely staggering. Remember that original price of $220 million per ship? By 2010, the average cost had exploded to over $500 million per ship. By 2015, some ships were costing over $600 million. And that didn't even include the costs of mission packages, which added hundreds of millions more. The program that was supposed to provide affordable ships was producing vessels that cost almost as much as far more capable destroyers. The U.S. Office of Government Accountability, an agency that audits federal spending, issued report after report criticizing the LCS program. They documented how the Navy had violated virtually every best procurement practice, starting production before designs were finalized, systematically underestimating costs, ignoring problematic test results, continuing to invest in technologies that clearly didn't work. It was a masterclass in how not to run a military procurement program, and the consequences were real. Every dollar spent on the LCS program was a dollar that wasn't being spent on other naval priorities. Submarines that needed modernization, missile defense systems that needed upgrading, crew training that was chronically underfunded. The Navy was pouring money into a black hole of aluminum and broken promises while other critical needs were neglected. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the LCS program was its impact on people. The crews of these ships were some of the most dedicated and professional in the Navy. They believed in the mission. They wanted these ships to work. And, repeatedly, they were let down by failing equipment, malfunctioning systems, and leadership that seemed more concerned with defending the program than fixing its fundamental problems. The LCS crews faced unique challenges. The ships were designed to operate with drastically reduced crews, around 40 to 50 sailors compared to the 250 or more on a traditional destroyer. The idea was that automation would compensate. In reality, it meant that each crew member was overworked, performing multiple roles, dealing with complex and often poorly documented systems. Fatigue was endemic. Mistakes were inevitable. And when something went wrong, there simply weren't enough people to handle the crisis. In 2016, one of the most revealing incidents in the entire LCS saga occurred. The USS Fort Worth, a Freedom-class ship, was operating in Singapore when it suffered a catastrophic propulsion system failure. Investigators later determined that the failure was caused by a combination of flawed design, inadequate maintenance, and an overworked crew. The main turbine lubrication system had been designed in such a way that small errors could have catastrophic consequences. And with such a reduced crew, there was insufficient redundancy to catch these errors before they caused permanent damage. The Fort Worth was taken out of service for over a year for repairs. When it finally returned, it was only to be decommissioned a few years later. And this brings us to one of the most shocking twists in this whole story. In 2019, the Navy quietly began considering decommissioning the first LCS ships. Ships that were less than 10 years old. Ships that cost hundreds of millions of dollars each. Ships that were promoted as the future of naval power. The official justification was that these early ships were too different from later models, making maintenance and training inefficient. The unspoken truth was that these ships were fundamentally flawed, and the Navy wanted to get rid of them before spending even more money trying to keep them operational. In 2021, the Navy formally proposed decommissioning 9 LCS ships, including some that had only 4 years of service. Congress was furious. Hearings were held. Admirals were summoned to explain how billions of dollars worth of practically new ships were being sent to the scrapyard. The answers were evasive and unsatisfactory. The simple truth was that the program had failed so completely that even the Navy no longer wanted the ships it had insisted on building. But let's take a step back and examine why this happened. How did one of the Navy's most promising projects turn into one of its biggest failures? The answers are multiple and complex, but some themes emerge clearly. First, there was technological arrogance. The planners of the LCS program believed they could revolutionize naval design through sheer willpower and ingenuity. They assumed unproven technologies would work. They assumed modularity would be easy to implement. They assumed reduced crews would suffice. All of these assumptions proved false, but at the time, anyone who raised concerns was seen as pessimistic or not visionary enough. Second, there was immense political pressure. Members of Congress whose districts would benefit from the shipbuilding pushed for more ships. Admirals who had staked their careers on the program resisted admitting problems. Contractors who were making billions had no incentive to sound the alarm. The result was a bureaucratic machine that rewarded optimism and punished honesty. Third, there was a fundamental risk management flaw. Any complex project will have uncertainties and challenges. The responsible approach is to identify risks early, develop mitigation strategies, and be prepared to pivot when things don't work as planned. The LCS program did the opposite. Risks were minimized or ignored. Prototypes were skipped in favor of immediate production. And when problems arose, the standard response was denial followed by rationalization. Fourth, there was a fundamental disconnect between what the planners wanted and what was technically possible. The vision of a truly modular ship that could rapidly swap capabilities sounds wonderful. But the reality of weapons systems integration, crew training, support logistics, and maintenance of specialized equipment makes this concept incredibly challenging. The Navy discovered that just because you can theoretically swap equipment doesn't mean it's practical or effective to do so. And then there was the fundamental question of threat. What exactly were these ships designed for? Initial planners envisioned scenarios of counterinsurgency, piracy, and smaller hostile states. But as China emerged as a naval power and Russia modernized its fleet, it became clear that the LCS were utterly ill-suited for high-intensity conflict. They had limited armament, reduced protection, and lacked the survivability of traditional ships. In a real conflict against a close-peer adversary, the LCS would exhibit significant vulnerabilities. In 2023, after years of debate, partial cancellations, and public embarrassment, the Navy finally admitted the obvious. In long-term planning documents, it effectively abandoned the central concept of the LCS. Future ships would not be modular. They would have full-size crews. They would be designed from the outset for specific threats. In other words, the Navy was returning to the basic principles of naval design that it had abandoned 2 decades earlier. The final cost of the LCS program is difficult to calculate precisely because it depends on how you account for research and development, infrastructure, logistical support, and mission packages. But conservative estimates put the program at over $30 billion. $30 billion for a fleet of ships that the Navy itself considers largely inadequate for its intended missions. $30 billion that could have been spent on submarines, destroyers, aircraft carriers, or any one of a dozen other more pressing priorities. And what does the Navy have to show for this massive investment? Around 30 LCS ships were built, of which several have already been decommissioned or are scheduled for decommissioning. The remaining ships operate primarily on low-intensity presence missions, tasks that could be performed by much cheaper vessels. The mission packages that were supposed to revolutionize naval operations are rarely used and even less often effective. Reduced crews remain overworked. Maintenance problems persist. And the international naval community sees the LCS not as a model to be emulated, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive ambition and inadequate planning. There are profound lessons here that go beyond naval acquisition. The LCS saga is a reminder that technology alone does not solve problems, that political pressure and wishful thinking are recipes for disaster, that ignoring early warnings only makes eventual problems worse, that genuine innovation requires humility, careful experimentation, and a willingness to admit failure and change course. It is also a reminder of the importance of institutional accountability. Throughout the life of the LCS program, there have been numerous points where courageous leaders could have paused, reassessed, and made fundamental changes. Instead, too often, bureaucratic inertia and self-interest led to decisions to double down on failed approaches. People who raised concerns were marginalized. Reports that documented problems were ignored or buried. And the machine kept rolling, consuming billions of dollars and precious years. For the sailors who served on those ships, the story is particularly bitter. They did their job with professionalism and dedication, even when the systems around them failed. They adapted, improvised, and overcame because that's what trained military personnel do. But they deserved better. They deserved ships that worked, reliable equipment, leadership that put their needs above preserving the program. And for American taxpayers who unknowingly funded this fiasco, it's a stark reminder of how public money can be wasted on a grand scale. $30 billion represents hospitals not built, schools not funded, infrastructure not repaired. Every tax you paid over 2 decades, a portion of it went to ships that are now being scrapped after only a few years of problematic service. Perhaps the cruelest irony is that while the American Navy was struggling with the LCS, other navies around the world were developing effective littoral ships using more conservative and proven approaches. The Chinese Type 054 frigates, the Russian Staragushi-class corvettes, the European Frem-class frigates. All of these ships were built for a fraction of the cost of the LCS and proved to be far more capable in their intended missions. The lesson is clear. Sometimes radical innovation is no better than the careful evolution of proven designs. As we look to the future, the Navy is trying to learn from the mistakes of the LCS program. The new frigate designs emphasize proven capabilities over revolutionary concepts. There is more emphasis on testing and evaluation before committing to mass production. And there is, hopefully, a renewed appreciation for the fundamentals of naval design that were neglected in the excitement of creating something entirely new. But the scars of the LCS program will remain for decades. A generation of naval officers had their careers defined by this program, some rising by defending it, others harmed by criticizing it. Billions of dollars were spent that will never be recovered. And public confidence in the Pentagon's ability to manage complex acquisition programs was severely damaged. There are also broader questions about American naval strategy that the LCS failure highlights. The Navy has struggled for years with fundamental questions about what types of ships it needs, in what numbers, and for what missions. The LCS was, in part, an attempt to answer these questions. But by failing so spectacularly, it has only made the strategic debate more confusing. If not the LCS, then what? How should the Navy balance the need for a global presence with the need for high-intensity combat preparedness? How should it balance quantity and quality? These questions remain largely unanswered. What is particularly frustrating is that there were alternatives available. The Navy could have taken a more incremental approach, building a few prototypes, testing them extensively, and only then committing to large-scale production. It could have been more honest about the technical challenges and more conservative in its cost projections. It could have developed less ambitious but more practical designs. All of these approaches would likely have yielded better results. But all of them would have required something that was scarce in the early 2000s: patience and humility. Instead, the institutional culture favored audacity and optimism. Admirals made promising presentations. Contractors guaranteed they could deliver miracles. Politicians wanted prestigious projects for their districts. And everyone pretended that the laws of physics, engineering, and economics could be bent by American will. Reality, of course, had other ideas. As we conclude this story, it is worth reflecting on what was lost. Not just the money, though that is certainly significant. Not just the time, though a generation of naval planning was wasted. But also the opportunity. The years 2000 and 2010 were a crucial window in the global power competition. China was rapidly building its navy. New technologies were emerging. Geopolitical dynamics were shifting. The American Navy could have used this time to strengthen its core capabilities, modernize its fleet, and prepare for the challenges ahead. Instead, it spent billions in a technological dead end. The story of the Littoral Combat Ship is ultimately a human story. It's about how intelligent and well-intentioned people can make catastrophic decisions when institutions fail. About how the pressure to succeed can lead people to ignore obvious warning signs. About how the complexity of modern technology can defeat even the most brilliant engineers when they try to do too much too fast. And about how, in the end, reality always wins no matter how much we try to deny it. There are heroes in this story. The engineers who raised concerns and were ignored. The auditors who documented the problems in report after report. The members of Congress who asked tough questions, even when it was politically inconvenient. And, above all, the sailors who did the best they could with flawed ships, because that is their responsibility and honor. And there are also systems and structures that have contributed to the problems, although they are less individuals than institutional processes. Acquisition systems that reward excessive optimism. Organizational cultures that discourage bearers of bad news. Political processes that prioritize short-term gains over prudent long-term planning. These systems created the incentives that led to the challenges of LCS and remain largely intact today. As we look to the future of the U.S. Navy, the question is whether the lessons of the LCS will be truly learned or quickly forgotten. New programs already exist with similar revolutionary promises. New technologies that will solve all problems. New approaches that will change everything. The temptation to believe these promises is strong. But history teaches us to be skeptical. Real innovation rarely comes from revolutionary leaps. It comes from careful, methodical progress, built on solid foundations, rigorously tested, and implemented with humility. The Littoral Combat Ship program cost the United States over $30 billion. It produced ships that are now being retired after only a few years of service. It wasted 2 decades of naval planning. And it served as an example that international analysts could point to when discussing challenges in military acquisition programs. But if, and this is a big if, the lessons are truly learned, perhaps all this cost will not have been entirely in vain. Perhaps the next generation of naval leaders will remember this story and make wiser decisions. Perhaps future acquisition programs will be managed with more rigor and honesty. Perhaps technological arrogance will give way to a healthy realism about what is possible and at what cost. Only time will tell. But for now, the Littoral Combat Ship fleet stands as a monument to what happens when ambition trumps wisdom, when optimism replaces analysis, and when powerful institutions lose the ability to correct themselves. It's a costly lesson, but perhaps a necessary one. Because in the end, even the most powerful nation in the world must respect the fundamental laws of engineering, economics, and common sense. Ignoring them may work for a while, but eventually, inevitably, the bill comes due. And when it does, it's paid in billions of dollars, lost decades, and dreams shipwrecked in the very coastal waters these ships were meant to dominate. May the wisdom of the Lord God guide those who make decisions about the future defense of our nations, so that they may learn from the mistakes of the past and build a more prudent and responsible future.